Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Hope everyone is off to a great start to their new year. Today we are very happy to welcome Dr. Glenn Suter to give our next installment in our ongoing MOOC series. Glenn Suter is recently retired from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Research and Development, where he was science advisor in the National Center for Environmental Assessment in Cincinnati and chairman of the Risk Assessment Forum's Ecological Oversight Committee. He has more than 300 publications, including 3 authored books and 4 edited books over his 43-year career. He was one of the founders of both ecological risk assessment and ecological causal assessment. He pioneered the development of formal processes for weight of evidence in ecological assessments. He developed a toxicity test protocol for soil processes that was adopted by the US EPA and OECD. He's received the Society for Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry Founders Award and the Association for Environmental Health and Sciences Career Achievement Award. And he's an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. His accomplishments were made possible by outstanding collaborators. So Glenn, thank you very much for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Oh, thank you, John. And just remind people that although I'm using EPA slide background here, I'm not still actively employed with the agency, and this talk has not been reviewed and cleared. So let's, The slides are not advancing for some reason. Oh, okay, there we go. The impetus for this talk, and I hope nothing critical is going to be covered up in these things, is a series of exchanges with Janneke about the origins of weight of evidence. She attributed weight of evidence to I.J. Good, who is a statistician and mathematician known for his work with Alan Turing on breaking the Enigma code, contributions to computer science, like he originated the idea that someday computers will be significantly smarter than humans. And he said that when we invent such a computer, that'll be the last thing we ever invent. And he made a lot of contributions to Bayesian statistics. Whereas I attributed weight of evidence to the ancient Greek goddess of justice, Themis, who is hidden behind all of our pictures. But she's the figure that you see in courthouses holding up the scales of justice that weigh the evidence for or against a criminal defendant or between two sides in a civil lawsuit. And I mentioned to Janneke that my father, who's a statistician, knew Jack Good, and apparently she was more impressed with me after learning that I had that connection. Good thought weight of evidence is log of Bayes factor, and Bayes factor is the quotient of the Bayesian probabilities of 2 models, and it's a standard way of doing a Bayesian hypothesis testing. And Bradley Efron, in a often cited commentary in the journal Science, pointed out that, and he is a Bayesian statistician, although he's known for having invented the bootstrap technique. He said that Bayesian statistics is becoming common without really understanding its limitations. And in particular, that you need to have legitimate prior information, such as base rates or a series of data sets like Nate Silver developed as a way of improving election predictions by, instead of using the latest polls, use the latest polls to update your estimate that was based on prior polls. And you shouldn't use uninformative priors, which most Bayesians in science do, unless there really is prior evidence that the probability is uniform across treatments or conditions. And really, why would you want to do an analysis if you thought there was nothing going on? So uninformative priors are a serious problem because the prior really does influence and to a certain extent determine the outcome. And statistics in general can't do the job of weight of evidence, as I'll explain, that it can only, like any other statistics, deal with the associations and not of a particular type of quantifiable information. And one thing that I've discovered when bringing up Bayesian statistics with managers in the EPA was they really don't want to tell the public that they're using a subjective probability. They much prefer expressing the variance as frequencies of occurrence. And another point is people say that the weight of evidence isn't good because it requires qualitative interpretation. And I'd like to point out that for Bayes factor and really for any statistics, you have to have a qualitative interpretation at the end. The numbers really don't mean anything to a decision maker. And so, this is Jensen's table of what he suggests is standard interpretations of a Bayesian null hypothesis test. So Themis's weight of evidence, back to our goddess, deals with more diverse types of evidence for a particular hypothesis, like witness testimony, defendant testimony, video, fingerprints, defendant's behavior, et cetera, et cetera. And it's the same with environmental weight of evidence. We have a lot of heterogeneous evidence that you really can't combine quantitatively. So how do you deal with these kinds of things? The traditional way of doing it, and the way it's still done most of the time in law, is with a narrative. You organize the evidence that you have in such a way that it makes sense and tells a story. And that's very appealing in our context too, but it's become less acceptable. People want a little more formality to weight of evidence. Another approach that is to have criteria for what is a necessary and sufficient set of evidence, like Coax postulates, which deal with determining whether a pathogen causes a particular disease, but a number of us have adapted it to the environment. And Peter Chapman's sediment quality triad. Then the third approach is evidence considerations developed by Sir Austin Bradford Hill, and also by the Surgeon General's Commission in the United States, which actually came out with a little smaller set first. And finally, formal structured approaches to weight of evidence, which is my approach, and I think increasingly common in our community. So just going to go through Coax criteria really quickly. I think that they're really useful if you can apply them. The prescribed evidence requires a research program to implement them in most cases. But you need to show that the agent that's the putative cause and the putative factor is associated. Well, you all are going to have the slides. You can go through these because I'm really, this is the last I'm going to deal with Coax criteria. My odyssey with weight of evidence begins at Oak Ridge National Lab. You can see part of it here. It's in the hills of East Tennessee. It was the original site for the Manhattan Project in World War II. But the headquarters of the Manhattan Project was moved to New Mexico after a German saboteur was captured in the city of Knoxville, not very far away. And so it's now a civilian laboratory. And the weight of evidence work that I did began with the application of Superfund to contaminated sites on the Oak Ridge Reservation and then other government facilities. And you have multiple types of evidence for the same hypothesis. This is nothing new to you. You have single chemical tests, contaminated media tests, biological surveys, biomarkers, pathologies, tissue concentrations, all sorts of evidence from a contaminated sites. And you often have multiple results for each type of evidence. So I developed standard evidence tables that had weights, and basic ones were high, moderate, and low weight, and scores with pluses and minuses. And after I left Oak Ridge and went to the EPA, I joined a project with Susan Cormier and Sue Norton, whom I believe some of you know. And the project was to determine to show how to determine the causes of impaired biotic communities. The EPA Office of Water had been doing a lot of stream surveys and lake surveys to determine which waters of the United States are impaired, but then they had no way of taking the next step towards remediation, which is determining what's causing the impairment. So the NCEA, the National Center for Environmental Assessment, was asked to develop some guidance. Susan Cormier was the project lead on that. And once again, there are multiple types of evidence and no analytical solution for causation. As we all know, association's not causation. And this is about the time that Bayesian networks started to be advocated as a way of determining causation. But as Judea Pearl says in the Book of Why, the Bayesian networks are not inherently causal. And so, what can you do with that? Well, you can use make the network itself causal. And this is like the network models that we've always used in assessment to develop models or just heuristically to understand the system. And they depend on expert judgment, but free-form expert judgment isn't always reliable. So I argue that the creation of a causal network must rely on some form of weighing the evidence for what the structure of the system is that you're dealing with. And we tried some workshops to create DAGs and Bayesian belief networks, and in my experience, they're really appalling. People are willing to guess at anything, and they were clearly just pulling numbers out of the air. And some of them I knew from my experience as a field ecologist and toxicologist really had no basis in fact. So out of the project on causation, we developed a guidance document for the Office of Water. They like to call it stressor identification rather than causal analysis. And then we followed up on that manual with the Causal Analysis Diagnosis Decision Information System, or CADIS. The first version was in 2005, and it's been updated a couple of times since then, but it's pretty inactive right now. But it's still, I think, a very useful decision support system for anybody doing causal assessment, particularly in aquatic systems. And then I and some other people felt that the agency needed some general guidance on how to do a weight of evidence assessment that was not particular to determining the causes of ecological impairments. So the Risk Assessment Forum, which is part of the Office of the Administrator in the EPA, under my leadership, developed guidelines in 2016 for weight of evidence in ecological assessment. It's actually a method that's applicable to human health assessment. We've done some of that now, but there's real stovepiping in the EPA between the ecologists and the human health people, and the human health people didn't want to play in our sandbox, so it says ecological. And we had some influence on other people. The EFSA weight of evidence guidance the following year used some of the weight of evidence approach that we developed in the EPA. This I just wanted to take a bit of a digression to advocate this book, Ecological Causal Assessment. I think it's the definitive text because it's the only text on how to do causal assessment for ecosystems. And CRC Press that published it didn't advertise it at all, and so it hasn't got much attention, so I'm going to just promote it to you. Okay. So how did we develop our weight of evidence guidance? We began with Austin Bradford Hill because he's the father of weight of evidence for health and environmental assessors. You see his considerations used all the time, but they're kind of a hodgepodge of concepts. Experiment is a type of evidence. Strength is a property of a piece of evidence. Consistency is a property of bodies of evidence. Temporality is a defining characteristic of causation, and it's one of the implications of evidence in causation. And there are, of course, more, but rather the remarkable aspect of Hill's considerations is he doesn't include co-occurrence or association. He just assumes that you have that, which of course we don't necessarily have when we're doing environmental causal assessments. So I felt that Hill needed an ontology, or at least a taxonomy of considerations. He didn't provide it, so I thought I would. And these are what I think of as the taxonomy or of the considerations. The first is how aggregated is the evidence. The minimum unit is a piece of evidence. You can aggregate the pieces of evidence within a type of evidence, like a acute lethality tests or a stream invertebrate survey or whatever sort of evidence you have. And then there's the body of evidence, which is all of the evidence that relates to a particular hypothesis. And then information isn't evidence unless it has some explanatory implications for the hypothesis. If otherwise, it just remains interesting information. It's not evidence. And so we need explanatory information implications for every type of evidence. Properties of evidence are the attributes of the evidence that you're actually going to apply weights to. The three fundamental properties of evidence that we came up with were relevance, strength, and reliability. And relevance and reliability are standard properties of evidence in the criminal justice system as well, so that they predate our use of them. And then there are sub-properties of each of these major properties that are specific to the problem at hand, or the case that you're dealing with. And there's properties of bodies of evidence, the number of types of evidence, or the number of explanatory implications that are covered by your evidence, any sorts of numbers. Coherence of the evidence, does the evidence make sense as a whole? Diversity of the evidence, you have lots of types, and absence of bias of the body of information. And that's kind of a tricky one. People don't like to be told that their evidence is biased, but in fact, we do see cases like deformities in frogs due to atrazine that had a clear bias in the evidence between those who were funded by industry and those who were funded by other sorts of funding, largely academic investigators. This is the definitions from the guidance document of those attributes or considerations, pieces of evidence, types of evidence, body of evidence. And once again, you'll have all of those when John shares the slides with you. And I think I've provided enough information about them. Characteristics of causation are our first example of a set of standard implications for evidence. Time order is essential. The cause has to precede the effect. If the effect occurs before the cause, then that negates the causal relationship. Preceding causation, which is also called antecedents, and for contaminants, that's showing that there's a source of the contaminants with a pathway to the putative effect, so that you know that any apparent association really has some causal strength behind it. Co-occurrence, of course, between the causal agent and the affected entity. Interaction of the agency and the entity, so that's like body burdens and biomarkers and that sort of thing. Or if you're not dealing with a chemical, it could be something like boat propeller cuts on a manatee. Alteration is actual changes in the affected entity that are preferably characteristic of the putative cause. And finally, sufficiency. This is, you have an exposure response relationship that shows that there was sufficient exposure to cause the effect. And you can have multiple types of evidence for each of these implications, but we feel that this is a good standard set of characteristics of causation. And this is the basic framework. This is pretty obvious. You start by assembling your evidence, you assign weights to the evidence, and then you weigh the body of evidence for the hypotheses. And of course, there's always more to it than that. Assembling the evidence begins with systematic review of the literature, which should be thorough and unbiased. And then hidden behind all of us, the explanation that you often don't have the information you need for the evidence that you want. And so you can conduct your own studies. This particularly happens with contaminated sites. And they should fill in the holes that the literature doesn't fill. You screen the information provided by those sources to make sure that what you've got meets some basic standards of being relevant and reliable. You categorize the evidence into types. And if you have standard set of implications like the causal characteristics, you categorize them in terms of those implications. And then you often have to extract data from the studies and reanalyze them, because the way that field and laboratory scientists analyze their data often isn't the way you really need it to do an assessment. And that's a step that I think a lot of environmental assessors neglect, is they just accept whatever statistics the investigator applied, and it's often not useful. Let's see, the binning of evidence I talked about a bit already. You can keep them in pieces of evidence if you really have few. You can, most of the times in my experience, you bin them into types: mechanistic studies, acute tox tests, chronic tox tests, biological surveys, etc. And then the largest bin is the body of evidence. And as I've already said, an alternative to organizing in terms of types of evidence is to organize in terms of explanatory implications. And I've already talked about that. So there's at least in the US and I believe in Europe, there's actually a bit of conflict between people who say that they're doing systematic review and those who say they're doing weight of evidence, when they're doing pretty much the same thing, which is making an inference from a set of evidence that is maybe gathered in the systematic review and maybe not. But systematic review in general has no provision for generating new evidence, and it seldom explicitly weights the evidence. And in fact, some just won't use the term weight of evidence. And they include an inferential process, but it tends to be rather simple. Whereas weight of evidence has not been really systematic about the way literature reviews are done, and we need to do a better job of that. It's included and encouraged in the EPA guidelines. But reviewing the literature isn't central to weight of evidence. And in fact, you can do weight of evidence without literature reviews. For example, at contaminated sites, nearly all the information that goes into the assessment is generated on a site-specific basis. And the emphasis on weight of evidence is not so much on assembling the evidence, but on how to do inference from the evidence. So how do we weight the evidence? We evaluate the evidence with respect to 3 properties and assign the scores. And the properties of evidence I've mentioned already are relevance, strength, and reliability. And we have three standard subproperties for relevance in ecological weight of evidence: biological relevance, are they taxonomically similar life stage, et cetera. Physical chemical relevance are the properties of the agent, the ionic state and that sort of dissolve versus particulate and so on relevant. And then is the environment relevant? Are you comparing streams to streams, or are you comparing ponds to streams? Strength of the evidence, the magnitude of difference between, say, exposed and reference sites, or the magnitude of effect in a tox test, the degree of association, correlation coefficients are the obvious example. And then the number of replicates, which we all were taught in statistics, gives you a stronger evidence. And then reliability, design and execution, abundance of a type of evidence is confounding, minimized in the case of field studies, et cetera, et cetera. There's actually, I think it's a whole page in the guidance. It's developed a listing all the types of reliability that we want people to consider. And then the scoring the evidence, we have three possible positive scores and negative scores. And as we discussed earlier with the Bayesian interpretation table, there's really different ways you can interpret these. Our standard one is convincingly supports or weakens, strongly supports or weakens, somewhat supports or weakens, but you can adapt these to your case. For example, I just published a paper with some EPA colleagues on applying weight of evidence to read across, and really nothing that you do in read across is convincing. So we changed that to exceptionally supports or weakens. So you need to think about how you want to present the concept that comes that describes your weights. So once you've evaluated and scored with respect to those properties, then you combine them into an overall weight for a piece or type of evidence. And you don't add the pluses and minuses, and you don't use numeric scores because these aren't quantities. And if you do add them up, you're going to come up with some nonsensical results. For example, well, I think we'll get to that again later. And then you weigh the body of evidence, and you begin by determining the overall weight of the body of evidence for each hypothesis. So you integrated in the previous step for the properties of weights, the properties of evidence for a piece or type of evidence. And this is now integrating for the whole body of evidence for a hypothesis. And this is a logical integration, not just addition of scores. For example, a piece of evidence or type may be highly reliable and strong, but have little relevance. Like you may have a great mouse acute lethality test and have strong results, but it really has little relevance to, say, an assessment of sea turtle toxicity, even though they're both vertebrates. So it would integrate to a low overall weight for that type of evidence. And then you consider the properties of the body of evidence, and that's the number, and there's various sorts of numbers. You can have number of types of evidence, number of pieces, diversity of the evidence. Is it all laboratory test results, or do you have some field evidence, etc.? And perhaps the most important is coherence. Does the body of evidence fit together in a way that makes sense? And absence of bias, we discussed before. And here is a generic weight of evidence table. It's from actually from an assessment that I did, and just took out the hypotheses. And this is weighing. This is for causation. So instead of types of evidence, we used the implications, the characteristics of causation as our bins. And you can see here the three hypotheses, and then the pluses and minuses and zeros. And then the body of evidence, number, coherence, absence of bias, and diversity scored. And then you integrate down the columns. And once again, this is not adding up pluses, minuses, and zeros. It's making sense of the weights. How much weight do you want to apply to a particular hypothesis? How credible is it? How much confidence do you have in that hypothesis is true given the evidence? This is another weight of evidence table. This is actually from an assessment of a proposed copper and gold mine in Alaska. Some of you may have heard of the Bristol Bay watershed assessment for the Pebble mine. And this shows that on the side that's mostly covered by us is explanation of the scores. And you have to justify the scores. You can't just throw out the scores and hope that people will understand why you put 2 pluses instead of 1. And you can, as in this case, explain, provide the justifications in the table itself. You can put them in footnotes, you can put them in the text, but you really have to justify all of the weighting. So that's the interpretation part of it. Which hypothesis is best supported by the weight of evidence, and with how much weight? And then finally, you have to deal with cases which unfortunately occur in which the evidence does not support any of the hypotheses. And that can be because there's the true hypothesis isn't in your list. It can be because the evidence is incomplete or misleading. But often you have to do some iterations here. You have to consider gathering new evidence. You have to consider, now that you've gone through the assessment process, you understand the system a little better, and maybe you misspecified the hypotheses, and you can create new hypotheses and go back and do the weight of evidence again. So weight of evidence for quantities. Most weight of evidence assessments that you see are for qualities like causation or carcinogenicity or biomagnification, whatever. But you may weight alternate estimates of a quantity as evidence of the true quantity. And examples are if you have that your quality is the cause of the impairment, then the number you need to derive is the total maximum daily load for that cause if you're in an aquatic system, for carcinogens, slope factors, for bioaccumulative chemicals, the bioaccumulation factor. And so you go ahead and you do your weight of evidence assessment for those qualities, causation, carcinogenicity, bioaccumulation, and then you estimate the quantity. And you can do that by meta-analysis if one type of evidence and one type of study will derive the quantity, like is done in the Cochrane Collaborative with their systematic reviews of human studies of medical treatments. But we seldom have that opportunity in the environment. And so what we have to do is then derive the quantity by looking at the weight of the evidence that contributes to the derivation of the quantity. So this is the framework for the weight of evidence for quantities. Weigh the evidence for the quality to be quantified, merge the quantitative evidence in a meta-analysis, or choose the best quantitative evidence and use that. And in either case, you want to explain the weight of that quantitative result. You know, how much confidence do you have in that result, whether you derived it by meta-analysis or by weight of evidence. You still want to give the user some idea of how reliable, how weighty the results are. And this is shows two ways you can contribute to overall confidence. One is the weight, which we just discussed over on the right. But you also need the traditional statistics of the data that went into that estimate, variability and uncertainty, which I've just combined called scatter. But typically, this is something like a confidence interval. So you have both a confidence interval and a weight. This is an example of a table that in which you express the results. You have the quality to be expressed, like a threshold for reproductive effects, numerical result in units, the scatter, the 95% confidence interval, and then the weight of the body of evidence, which in this case you say is highly relevant, moderately reliable, diverse, and coherent. So in summary, we have weight of evidence guidelines for the EPA. They have 3 basic steps. They're highly adaptable to various inference problems, provide common concepts and structure. Formal weighing of the evidence can make the results of an assessment more useful, increase defensibility and transparency. And because the method is flexible and can be adapted for purpose, it need not be onerous. And in combination with conventional statistics, weight of evidence can convey confidence in the results. They're logical rather than quantitative. They're not statistical or mathematical, because the implications of evidence are not independent, and the characteristic the systems being assessed are indicated by the implications of interactions in a logically concordant manner. For example, if a chemical occurs at a toxic concentration, but the toxicity test is negative and the community is unimpaired, then the evidence is all relevant and reliable, then we can logically conclude from that the contaminants are not bioavailable or are present in a non-toxic form. And we know what we can conclude from that in terms of further studies or a decision driving assessment. And Bayesian weight of evidence obviously can't handle that, wouldn't give you that result. So the primary sources here are the weight of evidence report, which you can find on the web. If you Google weight of evidence CPA, you'll find that report. And we wrote it up as 2 papers in IEAM because lots of people find journal papers more convincing than government reports. So I believe that's the last slide. And I've used most of the hour, but there's still about 14 minutes left. John, do we do Q&A at this point?
Yes, no, thank you very much. Yes, the floor, I'd say, is open for questions. I know I have some, but I will let anyone else jump in first. I'm not seeing anyone. You can send your questions to the chat or, of course, raise your hand. I do. One of my questions, Glenn, would be maybe how does the weight of evidence approach, I don't want to say fit in, but maybe could you speak a little bit to like the precautionary principle in the context of weight of evidence or as opposed to weight of evidence approaches?
Well, I think they're entirely different things.
Yeah.
The precautionary principle is a standard of proof, in effect. If you're doing weight of evidence, then that requires that you have very weighty evidence that shows that the hypothesis of no effect is supported. Whereas if you don't have a precautionary principle, if you have just a preponderance of evidence standard, then you don't have to have so much weight. You just have to have more weight on one side than the other.
Okay. In terms of, oh, sorry, Janneke, yes, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I thought that was a really good question, John, because in much of environmental management in Europe, precautionary principle is really a strong, how do you say it? What it all builds on, like the Water Framework Directive, where I come from, and it's been criticized in so many ways because it's too strict. It doesn't work in practice, and I think weight of evidence would be a better approach in many cases, also in this European legislation. But yeah, so a follow-up question really to Glenn is, I think you also mentioned differences between the US and Europe, and this is something that often interests me. So there are weight of evidence frameworks like what you present here, developed for US EPA, and maybe other guidelines for European agencies. Would you say they are similar, or are there any important difference between the way it's used in US and Europe?
As I mentioned, the EFSA guidance is, to my way of thinking, very similar. In fact, as I mentioned, they cite both this weight of evidence report from the EPA and some prior publications that Susan Cormier and I published before the the guidance was developed. And of course, everybody's got to have things a little different. You can't. One government never adopts another government's guidelines, or even one agency. But there are others, like the weight of evidence that ECA has is conceptually different, but because it's really focused on combining information from test data, toxicity test data, and I haven't looked at it recently enough to go through all the differences, but as I remember, it seems to me much narrower in its scope.
So you mean from test data rather than existing literature and so on?
Well, no, existing
no?
literature, but existing literature from test data.
Oh, I see. Only that type of data. Yeah.
The Australians a couple of years ago came out with some very nice weight of evidence guidelines on or guidance on how to develop water quality guidelines. I don't know if you've seen that, but if you haven't, you might look at that. But
Glenn, I have a question that kind of springboards off something that Janneke brought up in terms of how, from the precautionary principle, how there's been a lot of pushback from, or criticisms made of that, sort of related to the weight of evidence approach. As that was developed and implemented, was there any pushback from industry or other stakeholders in terms of implementing it, and any kind of ramifications that had implications for those stakeholders?
well, industry in the US has generally been supportive of taking a weight of evidence approach, particularly in that they want the EPA to consider all of the evidence in developing benchmark values, particularly with respect to human health. There's a tradition in the EPA of using the study that gives the lowest benchmark dose or the highest cancer slope factor. And industry, for obvious reasons, doesn't like that so much, and they want the EPA to weigh all of the evidence and come up with values that reflect the weight of the evidence.
Is there, because I know you brought up the instance where if you look across studies and you see that studies performed by academics versus industry folks, how there can be a bias there. Will industry, or has industry maybe gone and done their own weight of evidence assessment to kind of in some of these instances where there is some amount of judgment going in, where they might judge something differently and then use that as an argument against, say, what the EPA is trying to do?
Yes, they do that fairly often, actually. I don't know if you know Keith Solomon in Canada, and John Giese, and some of that crowd have actually made a fair amount of money out of being authors of reviews of various pesticides for industry.
Elise's computer has her hand raised, but is Marcus, I see you near the computer.
Okay. Hey, I have a question to the very first step of the evidence assembly, right? You said like that first, if you screen the literature, you might see some knowledge gaps in there that you might fill with additional experience to basically generate your body of evidence in the first step before you do the further process. But in the experimental world, to test some questions, let's say, there are also limits. So sometimes we cannot set up an experiment to answer a certain hypothesis or a research question. So we cannot fill a certain knowledge gaps that easily as we wish for. Is there another way to generate or to fill this evidence assembly then, or is it simply then dropping the research question or hypothesis in mind?
Well, there are obviously ways that you generate estimates of what would have happened if you'd done the test. There's QSARs, there's read across, there's increasingly techniques for using cellular and molecular responses to a chemical to estimate what the overt whole organism effect would be.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. Yeah, it's something to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, it depends on the case and what the regulations and laws are that you're implementing. Like in the U.S. with Superfund assessments of contaminated sites, there's a lot of leeway for doing site-specific studies, and those assessments often take 4 or 5 years to complete.
Okay.
Yes, Janneke.
I had a question about that, the final step where you showed some tables where you aggregate or integrate the different scores, and you pointed out you do not simply summarize the pluses and minuses and so on, but do you use some kind of, say, algorithm or rule or of thumb, or is it more subjective judgment, or how do you go about?
Well,
yeah.
We have in some circumstances, particularly with respect to the causal assessments, tried to come up with standard scoring systems. So if you look on Caddis or look in that report, the 2000 report, you can see that we've got a table in there that describes a particular type of result from a study, and then gives a standard weighting for that result. And that's ideally you would have that sort of thing in every case, that you would not be making it up as you go along, but would actually have some guidance on how to do the weighting. But that requires that you have some conventional sets of types of evidence and some experience with the evidence and some idea of what's how reliable it is, how relevant it is, how strong it has to be. That's another thing. Like in the weight of evidence that we did for salinity of freshwater streams, we had a lot of correlations between various biological responses and stream chemistries, and we had standard ranges of correlation coefficient of R squared for each of the weights that we applied. So yeah, to the extent that you can standardize the weighting process, that's all to the good. It makes it it eliminates accusations of just being arbitrary and capricious in your weighting. Yeah, should have included that in the slides. I didn't think of it. Good question.
No, but there's lots of information in the slides. So
Yeah.
just an additional question, and of course there's the papers which give more details.
Okay, we have reached 4 o'clock Europe time. Were there any other pressing questions that anyone has? Not.
Can I just add a final comment? Glenn, in your abstract, you said about this disagreement between us about the origin of the weight of evidence term. I would like to clarify, this was not a really disagreement. It was, let's say, ignorance from my side, which you pointed out, and I agreed immediately. So that was a short-lived disagreement.
Yeah, I didn't mean to be unfair to you.
No, it's fine. It's
I thought leading off with that would make it more interesting to people.
Absolutely, yeah. And thanks for following up with giving the whole seminar that you did.
Yes, thank you very much, Glenn. As Glenn said, we were going to make the slides available to everyone. I'll send those out once this is done. And then also we have the recording as well, which we'll put on our YouTube channel for everyone in the whole world watch. So again, thank you very much. This was very enjoyable, very insightful. And other than that, wish everyone a good afternoon, and Glenn a good morning.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.